Welcome all to the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Great to have you along for the ride. Thanks for being here. So I'm very pleased to introduce Greg Lilly as my guest today. He is a short story writer, a novelist, a freelance writer, magazine editor, and workshop leader. He's written a number of novels, and his recent historical nonfiction book, which he is here to discuss, Abingdon's Boardinghouse Murder, was a 2025 Agatha Award nominee. I appreciate so much you coming on. Great to have you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes. So do you remember when you first heard about this case?
Yeah. I grew up in Southwest Virginia, and I had heard kind of rumors about this going on, but never really paid much attention to it as a kid. I was in high school here, and then I went off to college, and then I got jobs and moved all over the country. And when I came back, we came back in 2018, and we moved to Abingdon. My family is in Bristol, which is 15 minutes away, and we bought a house. As we were looking for houses, the real estate agent was driving us around the historic district of Abingdon, and we drove by this one house, and he goes, "Well, the murder house is available." And I was like, no, I don't think so. And that was it. It was like, no, I don't want to know about that. So we found a really great little craftsman house here on the historic district. And it's actually, I can see the murder house from the bedroom window. So we're like a block and a half away. And during the pandemic, the people that actually bought the house had a 4th of July picnic. And so all the neighbors showed up. And when we got there, of course, we were social distancing, as you should in July of 2020. And people were talking about the murder house because we were standing in it. And everybody had a different story. Some of them were just really wild. Some of them made sense, but they were all different. And what got me was it was 80 years later and people are still talking about it. So
Right.
that's kind of, that's what got my interest in, because it was 80 years. Why are people still talking about this? So I gathered all the stories I could. And then I thought, well, I'm going to find out exactly what happened. So I started going through newspaper accounts from 1945 as to what really happened. And as you do that, especially in a small town, I think Abingdon today has maybe 8,000 people in it. There's probably descendants here. And if you're going to touch on something like that, you want to make sure that they're okay with it. So one thing I did, I went into ancestry.com because I'd always been interested in, my own family and things like that. And I thought, well, let me put in the woman that actually went to prison, put in her name. I know her dates and everything from the research, and I knew who she had married. She was a widow, and I knew 3 of her daughters because they were all listed in the newspaper accounts. And I started searching, and it went through, and I couldn't believe the oldest daughter of Helen Clark, who went to prison, her name was Dorothy. And Dorothy's oldest daughter, Gay, and she, as I looked at it, I was like, wait a minute, I know who that is. And she was my freshman science teacher in high school.
Wow.
So I had this circle. I was like, okay, there's somebody I know that was involved in this. So, and she's here. She's lives here, just actually less than a quarter mile from me. And she's not a teacher. She left teaching, I think, when my class graduated, and she became an attorney. So she's been an attorney in this town for many years. And so I met her for coffee, And I brought up that I was interested in writing about a true crime, a historical true crime that happened here. And she didn't miss a beat. She was like, "Oh, you want to write about Granny?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." At first, she was hesitant, but the more we talked about it, she kind of got on board. And she was a great help, and her sister was a great help in kind of getting that side of what the family said and what they didn't say about it. And that really helped flesh out the information, especially since everybody directly involved with it has passed. It's been 80 years. So it was good to have the granddaughters to talk about what their mother had said and actually what their grandmother might have said about it.
Right, yes. So would you tell us about Abingdon in the early 1940s, which is when this story takes place? What was it like?
It it was a booming town. Abingdon is the county seat of Washington County, Virginia. So a lot of attorneys here, the courthouse is here, and I've seen photos of the downtown, and it was, I mean, the streets were full. People would come from all over to shop in Abingdon, to go to the doctor, any of that kind of thing. We had, in the 40s, we had the Barter Theater here, and it's the State Theater of Virginia. Quickly about the Barter, and that pulled in a lot of people, and it really made Abingdon a diverse place. Robert Porterfield was an actor in New York, and during the Depression, he came from this area, and he'd come back here, and he realized that the farmers around here had all this produce. They were still farming, but they couldn't sell it. There wasn't people that really had the money to buy it, and they couldn't transport it and that kind of thing. And then he knew that in New York, there were actors that couldn't get anybody to come to their play because, that's kind of a luxury to go to a play and use money during the Depression for that. So he brought a bunch of them down, and they created a theater here. And it's actually the Barter, because farmers and townspeople would barter things to the actors to see a play. So we've got a troupe of actors. We have writers here. We have craftsmen. There's a lot of artists. We had the William King Museum, but back then it was the William King High School. And in fact, that's where Helen's children went to school. It was a hub at that point. So if anything was going on, like a trial of a local widow, the courthouse was packed, and people were standing outside, and everybody knew each other too. So it was small enough back then that if somebody said, "Oh, I heard this about Helen Clark," pretty soon the entire town would be talking about it.
So yeah, if you don't mind, let's talk about Helen Clark and her daughters and her situation in 1945 when this murder takes place.
Yeah, Helen was an interesting person. She was a Talbert, and the Talberts were a big family. Apparently, they were a handsome family. The girls were pretty. The boys were handsome. Her mother, which is interesting, Frances, or Fanny as they would call her, went to the Martha Washington College, which was a girls' college here, and became a teacher and taught in the Washington County Public Schools for years and years. So that was a rare accomplishment for this woman at the turn of the century to have gotten her teaching degree. And she had, probably 6, 7 children. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they were all boys, except for 2 girls. And of course, Helen was the youngest of the 2 girls. So she was the baby. She was the one that all the older brothers took care of. And she grew up just this charmed life of being one of the prettiest girls in town. She did have some tragedy. She lost a couple of her brothers along the way, but they were a close-knit family. Now, Gay had told me that her great-grandfather, her grandmother's father, was a bit of a drinker. And that seemed to be something that went through the family, especially on the male side. I guess that started in Prohibition, and even after it changed, they were still drinking. So, what was interesting was that in World War One, the boys went to Europe, and surprisingly, they all came back. Now, she had one brother that went to Richmond. He was working at a ammunitions factory for DuPont, and they were making gunpowder. And so he was exempt from being drafted. But he was in Richmond, and he would go to the department stores and send Helen, because Helen was a teenager by then, clothes from Tallheimer's and Miller and Rhodes, some of these big department stores there. So she would get these in the mail and go to her high school at William King, and she'd be the best dressed girl there. And you could tell that she had this aura of, this is my town. So
Right.
she was pretty. She was blonde, and kind of when you look back, there I've seen photos of the class, and she was like the girl in the middle of the class photo, and the only blonde there, and all eyes went to her. Now, when World War One was over, the guys came back, and Hal Clark had worked with her brother in Richmond, and then he had gone over to Europe, and he had come back. And so all these bachelors from World War One were back and looking for wives. And so Helen met Hal, and he was probably the most eligible bachelor in Abingdon at the time. The Clark family was very well to do, and they had some acreage and farms and things there. So they got married, and they just had, as Gay told me, she said her grandparents had a love affair that no one else could touch. Even when the children came, they had some people take care of the children. They had like a nanny, and they would take off and go to New York, or they would go to Florida to horse races. So they were living the life. During that time, they had Hal Jr. He was the oldest. Then the three girls, Dorothy, Nancy, and Frances. And the tragedy started, kind of when I think about Helen, it's everything she had to go through. The tragedy really started one night when Hal Clark had a heart attack, and they rushed him to the hospital, but he died overnight. So all of a sudden, Helen was a widow, and she was probably 38, 39, and he had always taken care of her. Then she turned to her parents, and within 6 months, her mother died, and about a month later, her father died. So the two of them were gone. So all the adults she had ever depended on had left her, in her words. They left her. Then World War II came, and Hal Jr. had graduated from the high school, and he had enrolled at Virginia Tech, which it was back then, it was Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Today it's Virginia Tech. But at that point, it was a military school. So they were all cadets. So, those boys were chomping at the bit to get into the fight of World War II, but they were holding them back. The seniors, they graduated them early and sent them on. Hal Jr. was just a freshman. So he finished his freshman year, and then the university itself said, okay, we'll hold your place. You're a cadet. You can go fight. So he enrolled he joined the Navy, and they sent him to the South Pacific, and he was killed near the Philippines. So when she got that information back, Helen just crumbled. Everybody that she depended on was gone, and it left her, at 42, probably at that point, with three or two teenage daughters and a daughter that was like 8 years old. So I think she had a lot of what we'd call today PTSD, all this traumatic um, experiences. So there was no money at that point. It wasn't like it is today that Hal Clark had a business. And what Gay had said, her being an attorney, she said, well, back then, if one of the partners dies, then the other partner, it's his business. It's not like the estate gets part of it. But the great thing was it was a service station, and Hal's partner allowed Helen's brother, her youngest brother, who was, he was in his 30s, to come in and help. So he allowed the family to come in. So there was some money coming in, but as most women of that time, widows especially, if they had a large house, they would take in boarders. And that's what she started doing. And at first, it was a lot of people that she and Hal had known from Florida. So if you had someone coming up here from Florida to Virginia and they were bringing their horses or going on hunting trips and things like that, they would stay with her just to help her out because they knew her and they knew Hal. But eventually that stopped, and she started taking in some local people. And one young girl she had come stay with her was Kitty Smith. And Kitty she was actually from Meadowview, which is only about 20 miles away from here. But she was going to college. And of course, as a young girl, she did not want to live at home. But she was living here. And I think it worked probably well for Kitty at that point, because here she was with a widow that was, not that much older than her. And then the girls were teenagers, and Kitty was like 21 or something. So it was kind of a little dormitory, I guess, for them. And I think they all got along well. But there must have been some kind of conflict, because Kitty did move out and moved to a different boarding house. And that was who Jimmy Newton was coming to see when he got stranded here. And that's how he ended up living in a boarding house.
So let's shift to James Emmett Newton. He was quite an accomplished young man, correct? And he had seen a lot in his 20 or so years on Earth, especially during his service in World War II.
Yes, Jimmy it was interesting because Jimmy was born just outside Louisville, and his father was very successful. He was like an insurance man. His mother worked, and they were very proud to have a son. As most, you hate to say it, but back then, the sons kind of got all the attention. He had an older sister who did very well. And in fact, she had a baby that they named James before Jimmy died. Now, his father was named James too. He was a junior. So they kind of kept that in the family. But when Jimmy was born, they did everything they could for him. He was quite accomplished. He was very musical. He could play the piano. He could sing. Just about any instrument he picked up, he could play. And he was very good in school. So he was doing everything he needed to do. And the interesting thing I found as I was researching him, Edsel Ford had put together a competition for young men, a driving competition. So the way they set it up, and the prize, of course, was to go to the 1939-1940 World's Fair in New York. So each state had a competition, and the winner of each state would go to the World's Fair and compete there. Jimmy actually won the Edsel Ford Good Driving competition for Kentucky. So that was a big thing for him to go to New York City. So I researched things like that and where he went, and I actually found a newsreel from Ford, and in it, I saw Jimmy. So that was incredible to see actually this person that you've only seen, newspaper accounts about, to actually I guess he was probably 17, moving around in a video. So he didn't win the big prize, but he had an adventure there that you could tell really stuck with him. First time he gets out of Louisville and he gets to go out and see the world. So Jimmy goes back and is in high school when Pearl Harbor happens. And within like the day after Christmas, I think, or the week after Christmas, after Pearl Harbor, he enlists with the Marines. So he hasn't even finished high school. And he enlists with the Marines, goes to Paris Island and starts training. He's worked at the motor pool. He has worked, they actually have him in the band because he's so good. So he does some entertainment for them. But for the main thing, they need fighters. And he is sent to the South Pacific. And he ends up in Guadalcanal. And just after they've taken the island from the Japanese. So he's there during that time. He gets hurt on a transport ship and they send him to San Francisco to the hospital. It must have been pretty bad because he was there for several months. And then they discharge him medically to go back to Louisville. And it takes probably a year for him to really recover and think about going back to high school and finishing his degree. During that time, after he's recovered, he goes to, well, he's in Louisville, and just if you're not familiar with this area, almost directly below Louisville is Tennessee, and then Knoxville is there. During that time, a small town outside of Knoxville was getting a lot of buzz. They were hiring a lot of people. It was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they were working on the atomic bomb. Nobody knew this. They wouldn't even tell when people went, but he ended up going down there looking for work. And that's where he meets Kitty Smith, who was boarding with Helen Clark. She had gone down there looking for work as well. So they start a correspondence back and forth. So what happens is he went ahead and finished high school and he enrolled at University of Kentucky. And there was a basketball game that he was going to go see one December. And what happened, he thought, well, I'll just go through Virginia and stop and see Kitty. So as he takes the bus, it comes into Abingdon that December, and there's a huge snowstorm that just stops everything. He's stranded in Abingdon, so he knows, well, he's got an address for Kitty, and it's at Boardinghouse. So he goes there looking for her. She's moved, and Helen's like, well, we've got a room. You can't go anywhere tonight. So he stays with them. And it's like the family he never had. His mother was very distant, and his father was so busy with work. But here was a woman that was motherly. She had these three girls. She was also very pretty and much younger than his mother. But here walks in this Marine veteran of Guadalcanal, and he's the exact same age as Hal Jr. So it was almost like she had a son again. And he ended up staying there, well, until they shipped his casket back to Louisville.
Right, yes. So yeah, it's a little bit unclear. Wouldn't you say what his relationship with Helen was really like? Whatever was going on between them, it was complicated. He was the same age as her son, so she probably felt motherly towards him. But she also found him wise beyond his years, and she saw him more as a peer than her junior.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that was some of the stories that I heard when we were having that July 4th, picnic over there at the murder house. Was some people were like, oh, well, she was 44, he was 22, and the whole town was talking about them being an item. But then others we heard, oh, he was a replacement for her son. And I think it just really depended. So those were some of the threads I was trying to straighten out as I did the research, and there was really support for both sides. And I almost wonder if both of their feelings went back and forth. It never really settled into one or the other. I think, he was obviously had shell shock from being injured in Guadalcanal, and she had PTSD from all the things that had happened to her. And I think at times, they might have had a romantic relationship. I think at times there were more contemporaries helping each other. And then other times she took on a motherly role with him. So that was the whole thing. It was like, what was the motive for this murder? How did we get there? And that's really what I tried to research and develop in the book, is like, how could this relationship flow in different directions and then end up on this tragic night where he shot and left for dead? So it was interesting. And again, I went back to the descendants and asked Gay about her grandmother, and she had heard that too growing up. All this talk in her hometown about her grandmother, and some of it was kind, some of it wasn't. So I asked her, and she said she had asked her grandmother, why'd you shoot that man? And Helen had said, I don't want to talk about it. She would never talk about it. Now, at this point, Gay's mother, Dorothy, who was the oldest girl, was probably 17. So she remembers, and she wouldn't talk about it either. Now, if Gay had asked her something directly, she would respond. I guess if she hit a hot button, she would respond. But the rumor was, just age-wise, that Jimmy was 22, Dorothy was 17. Could there have been something going on there? And, that's probably the most logical. In fact, that's what I heard from the Historical Society here when I went to research. The first thing when I brought up this case that I was working on, one of the guys was like, oh, well, he was messing with the daughters, and she took the revenge on him for doing that. And I brought that up to Gay, and I said, did your mother ever say anything about Jimmy, abusing her? And she said she brought that up with Dorothy, and Dorothy just looked at her and said, well, he wouldn't have dared touch me. And the explanation was that this family was so well liked in the area, in town, and Hal Jr. was like the little prince of the town at his time, growing, in high school and everything. He was a handsome kid, very outgoing, very athletic, and he had a lot of friends. Now, he didn't make it back from the war, but a lot of his friends did. And those boys looked out for these three girls. So Dorothy's answer was basically, I've got uncles here, I've got Hal Jr.'s friends here. He wouldn't have touched me. So I believe that. I think it was the time when Gay asked her mother about this that she probably would have said, yeah, he did. But she was adamant that he did not. He did not do anything like that. So that puts me back to the relationship between Helen and Jimmy, how it flowed back and forth, what could have really have happened there. And there are signs, as I went through it and looked, that Jimmy might have been bisexual. He had some very close friends. In fact, and in the book, his Marine buddy is Clark Beetlestone. And he lived outside New York. He was from New Jersey, And he and Jimmy had planned, once the war was over, to move to New York City together, and get a place, be young and be in the city. But it does come across Jimmy never really had. I mean, Kitty was kind of the only woman they ever talked about in Jimmy's life. And once Jimmy was here, he got a job over in Damascus, which is at that time, it was a timber town. He was a school teacher, and he was also the football coach. So he spent all his time basically at the school with his football team, and he got so that they would stay over there in the basement of the school and drink. So you wonder, was he romantic with Helen, or did he not have any interest in her? So you kind of have to go back and forth with that. So it got really complicated trying to know who these people were, and especially in 1940s, that wasn't something anybody talked about. So that would have been very taboo, and there was not going to be any discussion of it. Even the survivors, like Helen's three daughters, they would never have brought anything like that up.
Right, yes. So let's talk about November 18th, 1945. What do we know about that day? What were Jimmy's movements? When was the last time he was seen alive?
On that day, we know he was involved with the church. He would sing in the church. He would also helped out. He was what they call a lay reader, so he would read from the Bible at different places. And so he had gone to the service that morning. It was a Sunday. So he had gone to the service that morning, and he was supposed to go back in the afternoon. During the trial, I think Frances, no, I think it was Nancy. She was the middle daughter, who was 14 or 15. She said that she knew that Jimmy had been drinking between those services, that she could smell the liquor on his breath. And I think he was doing that because of the pain of his injury. He had hurt his hip and his leg. And then how you dealt with any kind of injury, either you took some hard drugs that just dulled you completely, or you self-medicated with alcohol. And he seemed to be self-medicating. But we know that he did go because Chief Bodden, who was a Marine himself, but he was conducting one of the services, and he testified that Jimmy was there and had helped out with the service. And then after that, we know that some of his football players from Damascus drove over because they had never played organized football before, and few of them had ever really seen a football game before. So Jimmy was starting from scratch with them, and every game they had, they lost. In fact, they didn't even score a point during that season, but they were enthusiastic, and they loved Jimmy. He was 22, they were 17 and 18, so he was like a brother to them. And so they would come see him all the time, and they drove over and parked outside the house, the boarding house, and Jimmy went out and got in the car with him, and they left. Now, at this point, Helen had planned to go to a movie, and it was really Dorothy, who was the teenager, the oldest girl. She had a boyfriend that wanted to go to see a movie, and Dorothy decided that everybody should go because she wasn't that serious about him, and she didn't want him to think it was a date. So on that Sunday, for Dorothy's date, she had just invited her sisters, her mother, and Jimmy. And what had happened was Helen saw that Jimmy got in the car and drove off with the football players from Damascus, and it made her mad because she was like, "We have plans, and here he goes off like a kid." So again, he's going back and forth from someone that she can confide in and then back to acting like a kid, acting like her son. So she was a little mad about that. And then when he comes back, she could tell he had been drinking with the boys. And he said, "Well, I'm not sure I want to go to this movie. Number one, it was a war movie, and he certainly didn't want to go see that." So they had some words, and the girls were waiting, by the car because they had to get down to Bristol to the movie. And finally, Helen went to him and said, "Jimmy doesn't want to go. I'm going to stay home too." And she sent the three girls and the boyfriend off in their car, in the Clark car to Bristol to the movie. What happened then, we don't know. Jimmy was there, Helen was there, and the next thing we know as a fact was that she walked from her house to the taxi stand, which is, I walk it, and it's just about half a mile. And she goes to the taxi stand and asks for them to drive her to Bristol. She tells the taxi driver that the girls have gone to a movie, left her behind, and that she wanted to go join them. She goes down there, and once the movie's over, Nancy says that she turned around and her mother is sitting behind her. And they ask where Jimmy is, and she goes, "Oh, he decided to go back out with some of the Damascus boys." So she told them that he had left. So the movie's over. They all get in the car, drive back to Abingdon. They sat downstairs and talked for a little while. And then I think Nancy and Frances and Helen, who the two younger girls and Helen, decide they're going to leave Dorothy and her boyfriend alone downstairs. And they're like, "We're going to go on to bed, leave the door open for Jimmy because he might not have gotten his key." And they go to bed. And then the boyfriend stays for just a little bit, and then he leaves, and Dorothy goes to bed. The next morning, Helen gets up and lights the heater. It's a gas heater downstairs, gets things ready, puts on coffee. And she hears the girls upstairs walking around. And one of them comes down, Nancy, the middle girl, comes down, and she's 14. And Helen goes, "Go upstairs and wake up Jimmy or he'll be late for school." So she sends her 14-year-old daughter back upstairs to discover Jimmy's dead body. And when she opens the door, Jimmy, they say, was on his back on the floor, fully clothed. He even had his sports jacket on and his shoes, as if he were asleep on the floor. And they thought he had gotten drunk and just passed out. And then when they went to touch him to wake him up, he was cold. So that starts the whole thing where there are, I think, 3 people from outside that show up before the sheriff does. They call their uncle, and he's at the service station, and he grabs a driver that's there getting gas for their delivery truck. And the two of them come over, and they say CM, Uncle CM goes inside upstairs, and the delivery driver stays on the sidewalk. And he testified that it was like 10 minutes before CM came down and told him to come into the house. And when he did, he went upstairs and he said, "Jimmy's dead. You need to call the funeral home." And then the funeral home shows up and they can't see anything wrong. So he asked if Jimmy had been sick. There's no blood. He looks fine. So they take him to the funeral home, and as they start to undress him, that's when they see bullet wounds, and that's when they call the sheriff. So there were 3 different outsiders that were in that house before the sheriff ever showed up.
Yeah. So the crime scene, it didn't really look like a crime scene at first glance, right? It appeared as though he was asleep, perhaps passed out from drinking. But once it was determined that he had been murdered, authorities do focus in on Helen pretty darn fast.
They do, mainly because when they asked what was going on, she had several different stories and they kept changing. At first, she had said that, Jimmy had left. And then she claimed that she heard something during the night and thought it was Jimmy coming home drunk. And then she said she thought someone in Damascus had threatened him and that it was some man from Damascus that might have killed him and then brought his body in and placed it there. And of course, the police found that far-fetched. And finally, I think what really got them interested in saying it was her, because there was really no one else. She was there. The girls had said, and the boyfriend was like, she and Jimmy stayed. And then we do have where the taxi driver said she showed up at a certain time. They left at this time from their testimony. Taxi driver says, well, at 9:00, she was asking for a taxi to Bristol, and they had left like at 8:30. So there was half an hour that was unaccounted for. And they had 4 bullet holes in Jimmy. And at first they thought, because one bullet fell out of his coat when they undressed him. So they thought he's been shot twice and it just went straight through, And so there's another bullet somewhere in the room. When they found that bullet, they knew what kind of gun it was. So they asked Helen if she had a gun in the house. And she said, well, there's a shotgun, but no, there's no pistol. Well, during this time, as word spread, a neighbor tells the police, oh, I loaned Helen a pistol, because there had been rumors that there was a prowler in the neighborhood. And she felt, her there with the girls, that she needed some protection. So there was a pistol. So they asked her, your neighbor said he gave you this pistol. Where is it? So at first she said, it is in the car, in the glove compartment. So the deputies go over there. It's not there. Then she's like, oh yeah, I think it might be in the china cabinet. So she's at the sheriff, or she's at the Commonwealth Attorney's office. So they send the deputies over to the house, look in the china cabinet, it's not there. So they keep going. And so Commonwealth Attorney and the Sheriff Woodward say, we're going to give you a chance to go back and see if you can find that gun. And as the deputy is driving her, which it's 2 blocks, she asked him, is it possible for someone to shoot themselves? And he's like, well, yes, ma'am, it is. And then she's like, well, is it possible? Because they had done an x-ray and realized that he was not shot twice, but 4 times, and 3 of the bullets were still inside of him. So she was like, well, is it possible that someone could shoot themselves in the back? And he was like, no, ma'am, that's really not possible. So then she decided to change her story again. And that's when they went back to Commonwealth Attorney's office, and the sheriff was there. And she said she was trying to protect Jimmy's family because he was suicidal. And that was her story, that she walked in on him. They were there by themselves. He went up to his room and she was like, well, is he okay? What's going on up there? She walked in on him. He had a gun and he was going to shoot himself. And she tried to take the gun away from him and it went off 4 times. And that was her story. But as they looked at it, there was like, well, there's no way he could have shot himself in the back. And she claimed that in the struggle that it had gone off in her hand and hit him in the back. Now, the main part of the testimony was one of the deputies had gone to ammunition school in Radford, Virginia. And he testified that the gun they have was what they called a squeezer. And it could not fire. There's a lever on the handle that has to be held in with your palm, and then the trigger has to be pulled at the same time. And Smith and Wesson did that so that children wouldn't get a hold of it, because your hand had to be big enough that you could do both those actions at once. And so there was no way a child could pick it up and accidentally shoot it. So he testified that, well, there's no way that could accidentally go off. It's a safety feature. So that's when they charged her.
Right. The trial, as you said, was a really big deal.
Right.
And the attorneys, the judges, the jurists, they were all pretty familiar with each other.
Oh yeah, because Hal, her husband Hal had been on town council for several years. Hal's uncle had been mayor, like at the turn of the century. And so they were all in the American Legion together. They were on town council together. He knew their children had played together. So the attorneys, they knew the family. They had known them for years, but they were on both sides, prosecution and the defense. So it was difficult for her to sit there and look at these men that she had been to their house for dinner, and they were prosecuting her. And the interesting thing, and I didn't even think about this as I was doing it, but I should have. It hit me. I was like, well, all the attorneys are men. Everybody on the jury is a man. And I was like, well, it's 40s. And that's what she was up against. But her defense, I think, tried to use that in that they claim, okay, the jury was made up of 11 farmers and one merchant, and they were all married. I think they were probably from their late 20s up to their 70s. And the defense brought up the reason she changed her story so much was that she was going through the change of life. And I put in the book, because just trying to imagine that, it's like these men knew what that meant, but they certainly did not want to hear any details or talk about it in court. So I think that was one way they tried to deflect actually what had happened, the defense did, because they knew these farmers were not going to go back into the jury room and talk about a woman going through a change of life. They just knew that she could be unpredictable. And I think they tried to use that as part of her defense. And I think it kind of worked.
I mean, it was a tough sell, her story, right? Especially the part where she claimed the gun had accidentally gone off conveniently into his back. It would have been a better strategy for her attorney to focus on an alternative suspect.
Right. And they did pull up, I think it was, and I was trying to remember, I think it was one of Dorothy's boyfriends, not the one that she went to the movie with, but they had asked him if he had ever felt jealousy for Jimmy being there. And they actually got him to confess that no, he didn't feel that way. And basically it came across like if anybody would have done it, it would have been this young man. And he proved that no, it wasn't him. So there was like no one else. They tried to eliminate any other possibilities, because they did have some of the Damascus football players, their family come in, and say, was there a man in Damascus that was after him? They talked to the principal over there, and he's like, oh, everybody loved Jimmy. He was, he didn't have any enemies. So they kind of went down that way. But of course, then her confession that she wrote up and signed was that it was an accident. So she had admitted she was there when the gun went off, but how it went off was up for debate. She was saying it was an accident, and they didn't do a very good job of it because they were saying that she was jealous and that he might have been showing affection for a younger woman. But the thing was that the bad thing that the defense did, they never made Jimmy out to be a ladies' man. And their defense was, oh, somebody else, some jealous husband or something came in, but they never proved it. Both sides made Jimmy out to be like a Boy Scout. He's just upstanding citizen. They never brought in any other women, any other girlfriends, any jilted boyfriends that Jimmy had taken their girl away from him. So they never proved anything. There was never the only motive they had was either she was jealous of some other girl and she was mad at him. It was just a difficult thing for them to do. Now, as I went through it and as I get to the end of the book, I put all the scenarios out, and after all the research, tried to address each one as to what it could be, because again, there was never any explanation of that motive. I mean, we know she did it. She confessed to having the gun as it went off. But the thing is, the jury was so sympathetic to her because she was a widow and she had lost everybody. And they kind of realized all the trauma she had gone through. And then they topped that off with her going through the change of life. So these farmers and the merchant basically give her 5 years at the state penitentiary. And I think she only served maybe 2 before she was back. The punishment was not bad, and I feel sorrow for his family, that he had so much potential and he had so much going for him. So his sister and his mother and father, I mean, they all lived long lives without him. And it was just a tragedy all the way around because of all the people that it affected. And even the boys in Damascus, the football players, I mean, he was their hero, and they lost him like halfway through the school year. So that just scarred the school for years.
Right, yeah. There was an allegation that Helen Clark had used the name Mrs. Jimmy Newton, right, at one point.
Yes, there was, and I was trying to think. She had gone to the movie house here in Abingdon, and they were having some kind of contest, and you would put your name in a hat, and they would draw for it. It was basically like a little lottery for some cash, and she put in her name as Mrs. Jimmy Newton or James Newton, and I think it was Kitty that brought that up in the trial. And they kind of tried to blow it off as if, oh, she was just kidding around. But again, I mean, that makes you think that that flow back and forth from son to lover was constant. There were times that she, kind of thought that he would take her husband's place. And then, other times he's a child. And I think at 22, even though he had been through the war, I think he was still at that level. And it didn't really help him being the coach to a bunch of teenage boys, because they would go drinking up in the hills in a cabin. And they even said that one night she came looking for him. So he's up there in the cabin in the woods with his football team, and they're drinking and having a good time. And they knock on the door, and they open it up, and there's Mrs. Helen Clark looking for Jimmy, just like one of the teenage girls looking for her boyfriend. And so that was brought out in the trial. So it was very sticky, and I think that's why people still talk about it. It's like there was no definite. It wasn't like he abused one of the daughters, as most of them say. He abused a daughter and she just took their revenge on him. No, it wasn't that simple. It was just two broken people that ended up in the same room with a gun.
And Jimmy had allegedly written a suicide note and then tried to kill himself by overdosing on pills.
Right. That was Nancy, the middle girl, had said that during the trial. Now, the prosecution did bring out that it was it was written on Nancy's school paper, her notebook paper, and that Jimmy's father looked at it and said that's not his handwriting. So there was some, were they trying to cover for their mother, by coming up with this story, because there was nobody else there. They couldn't get a hold of anybody, any doctor that said this had happened. So they kind of cast doubt on that story. But it was something that it fell in line with someone that had shell shock from the war. And I did talk to a retired general. He's not that old, so he just recently retired from the Army, but he worked with a lot of people that have PTSD. And he said that constantly with PTSD and back in the 40s with shell shock, that there were certain triggers that would come up. If it was a time of year, if there was a certain song that they might hear that would remind them of something, they could just fall into this deep depression. And that was all they could think about was, I just can't keep doing this. And so it made sense. I mean, I think people would believe it. The prosecution just punched holes in it, basically saying the girls were trying to cover for their mother.
Right. So she was found guilty of murder in the second degree, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Is there any information on how she fared in prison while she served her couple of years?
Well, no, there's not. Even talking to the family, they said that they were surprised that she came back so early. And, I think she probably got some help there. I think even in the 40s, they had psychiatrists working with the women in the prison system. And I think she was a model prisoner because it was just one of those, it was like something just broke. But after that, she was kind of back to where she was. And they said that in the years that followed, she came back to Abingdon and lived in the house and, worked. I mean, people still kind of whispered about her, but she worked down at the movie theater in the ticket booth. And the little kids, of course, in the 50s and 60s were like, oh, that's the woman that went to prison for murdering somebody. And of course, but on the other side, if it started raining and their parents hadn't come to pick them up, she would go out there like a mother hen and gather them up and let them sit in the box office with her until their parents showed up. So she was very much motherly and grandmotherly to people. And it was almost just like it was an episode and it just happened. And it was unfortunate they were both together and it kind of happened at the same time for both of them.
Right. Well, gosh, what an interesting story. I would imagine that a lot of the people in Abingdon are pretty pleased that you took the time to put this book together.
Oh, yeah. This is the first time all the information was ever pulled together in the 80 years since it happened. And a lot of people have, like I said, have talked about it and had different ideas about it, but to actually gather the information, all the facts together, and talking to the descendants, this is the first time it's ever been put together. And I was very happy that, the granddaughters read through this and they were like, it's fair. It's fair. they didn't like everything, because it was their grandmother, but they said those are the facts. Especially Gabe being an attorney, she's like, well, Granny did it. The court decided, a jury of her peers decided that yes, she did it. The court system said she did it, so she did it. And the big mystery is just why, how did these two people end up with a gun between them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you have a website, and as I mentioned a bit in the introduction, you've written some novels.
Yes.
So if listeners are looking for new fiction, they can explore these books further on your website.
It is greglilly.com. It's interesting because I never thought I would like to do nonfiction, because I was like, well, fiction's so much more fun because you can just come up with these ideas and move the characters where you want them to move and that kind of thing. But as I got into nonfiction, I was like, I really like this because you're given these parameters of the truth, and it's like, now you have to figure out, who these people were, what their motivation was, why this happened, and what the results were. And it's a lot of research, and it's easy to get lost in the research. In fact, when I turned this book in to the publisher, they said, oh, we really like it, but you need to cut 10,000 words.
Yeah.
I was used to novels, which are like, 75,000 words, 60,000 words at least. And they had a word count, and it was just too long. So I took out a lot of stuff that I really liked, but I think it made it a much tighter book. And I'm very proud of how it turned out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, gosh, again, I so appreciate you coming on and talking about this, and I'll put the link to your website in the show notes. And yeah, thanks again, Greg.
Well, thank you.
Again, I have been speaking to Greg Lilly. He is the author of Abingdon's Boardinghouse Murder. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe tomorrow.